Hello there.
Hey, Kim. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, I'm so excited to talk to you during this show. There's so much I want to ask. I don't even know if we'll have enough time to cover everything.
Okay, I'm down for that.
But first of all, I have to say, and I want to tell everyone that's listening that Kim has a pedigree as it would take a whole other show to list everything that she's done, is doing, is involved in. As a matter of fact, I stopped printing after 7 pages. No, I'm exaggerating, but it seemed like that. I was reading it. I was like, do you even sleep at all?
I do. I've gotten better. My body makes me go to sleep. So.
Well, listen, Kim is the executive director of Pride Action Tank, and she's the senior director of policy and advocacy operation for the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. She's been inducted into the Chicago LGBT Hall of Fame. She co-hosts an, I guess, Outspoken, which is an LGBTQ storytelling right here in Lakeview, where I live. I live in Lakeview East.
Okay.
And then it just goes on and on and on and on. I mean, I literally can. It's a full page of everything that you've done. First of all, thank you for being on the show. I am, in essence, a sponge. I want to learn about all of this. Now, I don't know how much you know about me, but to give you a little bit of background, I'm a publisher. I published several publications, LGBT publications. I was the president of the National Equality Media Association. I'm currently the CEO of Equalitas Media, which is one of the largest LGBT media placement agencies in the country. And I'm the executive director of the Equalitas Advisory Board, which is a list of 12 national LGBT luminaries in business and media, sort of like a think tank to try and help us coalesce our message to brands and agencies and so forth. And when Nick was telling me about you, and I thought, I really want to learn about this. This is something that I can share on such a broad platform with other publishers, and I wonder how many of them are really aware of this. And some of the things that I've read, I know I have not been aware of. So tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing and what the focus is. Let's start with that.
That sounds good. And first of all, let me say, I don't know when you sleep. That's a long list of things.
Podcast.
That's
why I relate so well.
Yes, and thank you, Nick, for coordinating, and thank you for both for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. So I will say that I have a career that spans probably 30 or so years, which is hard to even wrap my head around.
Tell me about it.
The first part of my life was actually as an urban planner, and I did that work primarily at the Chicago Transit Authority, where one of the things that I gained some experience in that has carried me throughout life is really talking to community and trying to find a way to help community connect to resources, but also help those institutions that have the resources connect to community. Sometimes those two big groups are speaking different languages,
sure,
but trying to communicate with each other. So along the way, there's a whole coming out story that your listeners will have to come to Outspoken to hear more about.
What? Keep me hanging? I was dying for that.
We'll come back to that maybe later.
Okay.
But yeah, so first half of my career, transportation planning. I decided probably in my early 40s or so, to go back to school. To get a second master's degree. So moving from urban planning to public policy studies. I do not recommend that people get 2 master's degrees, totally unnecessary, but that's what I did. And gained a lot of different experiences from consulting work in that space. And also came upon a time where I realized that I was overqualified to be hired right off the street. I had 12 years of work experience and 2 master's degrees. And so I needed to do something. And I co-created a consulting firm that focused on community and economic development. And while I was doing that work, was asked to join the board of Affinity Community Services, which is a organization on the south side of Chicago, focused primarily on the Black LGBTQ community, and more specifically with female identified folks. And through my tenure on the board, Affinity was fortunate to have some pretty good fundraising opportunities that led to some multi-year grants, and they were able to hire an executive director during this time. And it just happened to be at a time when I was burned out from consulting work.
It can do that.
Yeah, it was great running my own shop, but it's also nonstop working. You know, you're doing business development, and then you're also having to do the client work. And even though we had a small and amazing staff, we hadn't reached the level where the two founders could kind of step away from the client work. So I stepped off the board, applied for the Affinity job, and they hired me. I was at Affinity for about 7 years, and in that time, in conjunction with an amazing board, we were able to move it was a 15-year-old organization when I first came in, and I was the first executive director. And so we were able to secure enough funding to move from an all-volunteer organization that had done just groundbreaking work to an organization that had a small staff. And when you're running a small business, when you're running a small organization, you do everything, right?
Oh, yeah.
From the QuickBooks data entry to, cleaning up after the events that we had, all the things. But it was great.
Believe me, you're preaching to the choir. And as a matter of fact, producer Nick, I try and mentor him about what it's like to run a small business. It's not all, glory and cashing big checks, is it?
No, it is not. It is not. But it was a great opportunity at the same time, because I got to work very deeply with folks who were really committed to, I will say, LGBTQ liberation, but also looking at the intersections of Black identities and female identities, as well as queer. And so that work looked like anything from having regular peer-led groups where we had volunteers who were sort of leading programs for their affinity groups, so to speak. So depending on age, depending on identity within our rainbow, to working on policy issues like marriage, to essentially being a representative to talk about Blackness in LGBTQ spaces and queerness in Black spaces. So it was a range of speaking opportunities and just awareness building in my tenure there.
And let me ask you, Kim, one of the things that I seen throughout the material that I've been reading about you was homelessness, the problem of youth homelessness, right?
Yeah.
So I've spoken about this. I've given speeches about this, and this is why your coming out story was so intriguing to me. Mine was very different as well. I didn't come out until I was in my 40s, early 40s. I was a pilot in the U.S. Air Force. I couldn't come out.
Yes.
My career would have been over. But one thing that I didn't understand, I still don't understand, is how do parents who love their kids put them on the street at a very vulnerable stage to be vulnerable to predators, to criminals, to society in general? A 16-year-old is not equipped emotionally, intellectually, financially, or in any other way to deal with the rigors of life, let alone without a roof over your head or some sort of stabilized food, or you know what I mean? I just don't get that. I don't care what your faith is or what your belief is. How do parents, and in your experience, why do parents think that any one of those things takes precedence over their responsibility as a parent?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like you, I didn't come out until I was grown, and I had been married and with kids. And while at Affinity, we did some work with youth who were experiencing homelessness or who were having tension in their families around their identity.
Sure.
And it was towards the end of my tenure that Tracy Bain of Windy City Times and we, through Tracy's leadership, created the Summit on LGBTQ Youth Homelessness. And I had 2.5 days of really being steeped in this issue from the perspective of young people who were experiencing it. And in my work over the years, I've talked with both parents and with young people. With young people, what I have found, a couple of things. Well, let me go back to parents, because you asked a very important question of how can parents do this? And I agree. I just, it's unfathomable to me that you would turn your kid out and put him on the street. I have spoken to parents, and there are many stories, right? Some of the things that have come out in the conversations I've had is that, one, many of them don't really know what they're putting their kids out to. They don't have an experience of being on the street.
All you have to do is watch Law and Order to know what's out on the street.
Yeah, but they don't think that's happening to their children. And I people disconnect on things that they know that they need to deal with. They just don't think it's going to happen. And I think in many cases, parents think it's going to be a temporary thing, not just the queerness or transness being a phase, but that the young person will come back and get their act together and just not display that in front of their parents until they can move out. And oftentimes, parents do not leave the door open even for that. So young people don't know that that is an option, and it's not a healthy one, honestly.
No.
Parents also are, it's amazing how some parents feel like faith is part of it, but also it's letting go, or the potential of letting go of whatever social circles they have, and their own sense of identity and sense of who their kid is. And I think with some intervention, there are parents who will find a way to make it through until their kid moves out, and not have a hostile environment. But that requires an openness, and it also requires knowing that there are resources available. And for the young people, what I hear over and over again, and what some of my colleagues have told me who work more directly with young people, is that they really want to go home. They want to be with their family, even if it's a messed up situation. They want to go home. But they don't know that they can, and they don't know that they'll be safe when they get there. But it is amazing how many parents don't know what their kids are going to have to endure when they put them out on the street.
Well, I can tell you that as an adult man who was very successful in my career, a decorated war veteran, who was at the pinnacle of my power, if you will, in my flying career, when I went to talk to my mother about being gay, I literally was petrified.
Yep.
And my father had passed, and I never had a chance to chat with him before. My mother was very loving and supportive, but I was petrified, Kim. And I'll never forget the moment, and I get goosebumps even just recalling it. She's passed now, but I never forget the moment I stood at her door, and I was like, this is the house. This is where I grew up. This is everything that is familiar with me, everything that is positive and great. And I'm standing here like a complete stranger, petrified to even touch the door handle. First of all, I sat in the driveway for a good 10, 15 minutes in my car. And then I stood at the door and I walked in. Everything was the same. My mother was in the kitchen. She was Sicilian, so she was always cooking. And I walk in, and the first thing is she was very little. She was 4'11" 3/4.
Wow.
And she used to say, "I'm 5 foot if she did her hair." Right? She didn't want to be below 5 feet. But she had a little stool in front of the stove, and that's how she would cook her sauce and or gravy, as she called it. Right? That's what Italians call spaghetti sauce.
Mm-hmm.
And I walk in, and she turns to me. The minute she looked at me, Kim, I started crying.
Oh.
I was like, and the first thing is, she's like, "Are you okay? Are you sick? Are you in trouble? Do you need money? Do you need food?"
Wow.
All the gamut. And I said, no, all of that. And I couldn't even say that I was gay. I had to say, I think I'm gay, right? Even though I knew I was gay from like 10. Right? So we sit down at the kitchen table because everything happens in the kitchen. That's where we grew up, in the kitchen. Sit down at the kitchen table, and I told her that, and she goes, "Oh, that? We've known that for years. We were just waiting for you to figure it out." And then she started crying, and then, it's sort of like we talked a little bit, but I want to tell you something, Kim, and I feel free to share this, and I said this in many speeches that I give across the country, is my mother was not literate in all the sophistications of coming out or any of that. But she did give me some good advice, which saved my life. I believe it saved my life. She said, "I don't understand this, but I will tell you that if you focus on being a good human being first, if you focus on that, then everything that's filtered through that will be good. And you don't have to worry about being a good gay person or a good this person or a good this. Focus on being a good human being first, and then everything you're involved in will be filtered through that." And when I was trying to merge my two lives, which I had managed, and I'm sure you can understand this as well, it was so stressful to manage two separate lives. When they started to merge together, I just kept saying, I don't have to be perfect this or that, or I just have to be a good human. And that's what I held on to. And then I was able to transition. And now, I may not have all the answers. And Kim, I don't have the history, probably like you. I don't have like a history of advocacy or being part of any sort of uprisings or gay bashing or any of that. I didn't have any of that.
Yeah.
Right. I don't have any of that history. So a lot of times I have to overcome that. Now, Maren Johns, who is the editor-in-chief of Curve magazine, was on my show the other day. She's a lovely human. I love her to death. And we're both publishers, and we were talking about that. Like, how did she come to grips with it, and how does she survive? And she's lesbian and a woman and a female, having to overcome both those barriers. And oftentimes she goes, it was very difficult, but without a good support mechanism, a good support network around her, she told me it would be very difficult, would have been much more difficult for her. So the point that I'm getting to is, even as adults, as secure in who we are, financially secure and everything, it was still super traumatic to cross that bridge. I can't even, Kim, imagine what it's like to be 16, 17 years old and saying to your parents, I'm gay or I'm lesbian or what have you, and then them say, get out. Get out. I don't want you in my house. You can't have supper at our table. You're not part of the family because God said so. And by the way, I'm a Christian too. And so it was very difficult for me to reconcile all of those, my faith, my family, my everything. And then you just can keep layering it on top of that. One of my first interns at the show was transgender, and I had very little experience with transgender people. And she was wonderful. And I said, listen, I don't understand everything, but I know you're a good person. You're a good person. That's what I'm starting with. And we built on that. And by the way, non-binary, African-American, lesbian, gay, bi, and everything else in between. Whenever I don't understand something, the first thing that I hone in on is, how are they as a human being?
Yes. Your mom taught you well. Yes.
Well, that is the save. And I think you can agree, can't you, that no matter what our differences are, no matter what anything is, the first thing you should be looking at is, are you a good human?
Yeah.
Are you a good human being? Because everything else is is subjective, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely been my approach in life. And I, too, was fortunate to not have the experiences that you named. And when I talk about coming out, I mentioned that I was good and grown when I came out, but I did, too, also have that experience of feeling petrified about having to have the conversation. And the response for me was, well, very well too, from my mom and dad, who were divorced since I was 3, but just were remained supportive and loving and said the right things, even though I am assuming that they did have some sort of inner turmoil going.
Yeah, and I think that's normal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure my mother had some inner turmoil. The first thing she said was, "Are you safe? Be careful,"
Mm-hmm.
and all of that. AIDS was still a big thing, and she was worried about my career in the Air Force because I hadn't yet retired, and would that affect my retirement? And she goes, "Don't say anything." And so the last 3 years I was out to my family, but I couldn't be out publicly because all someone had to do was say, "Oh, I saw Captain Doran at a gay bar," and the military used conduct on becoming an officer as the catch-all,
Mm-hmm.
and that was it. No justification required. So I had to be really careful. And I think that as an adult, if you think about this, and this is what's frightening to me, and I was looking at some of the statistics for LGBT homelessness, Black LGBT homelessness, and I was thinking, my God, those numbers are astounding.
They are.
And depressing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not talked about nearly enough. A few years ago, I was at a conference. I think it was the Congressional Black Caucus Conference, actually. And I was in the audience for one of the women's breakout sessions. And I wasn't on the panel or anything. We were having I guess the person who was moderating the program actually sort of opened things up for the audience. And I pointed out that, while folks were talking about, healthy families, healthy kids, and whatever other things were being discussed, I said, one thing that folks need to understand is that you have got to stop kicking your gay kids out of the house. And the room was like first silent, but then a tremendous amount of support. And people started coming up to me, talking about their trans child or their gay child or lesbian, all the letters. And we wound up having a really robust discussion. And I shared some of the statistics with people. And folks were horrified because it's not a topic of discussion. And even within, I will say, policy spaces around homelessness, it isn't talked about enough. The people who are doing the work in direct services, they see it every day. But folks outside of that circle don't see it and don't talk about it nearly enough. And one of the things that we've done as Pride Action Tank, which is the job that I do now and what I did moved to right after Affinity, is we bring awareness to the issue. And in our first year, we had this huge sleep out. And in preparation for it, we worked with an agency that interviewed young people. And this was after our Youth Homelessness Summit as well, and created graphics around the issue about how a lot of times youth experiencing homelessness are just invisible to us. They don't look homeless. They don't, they're trying to go about their days like another young person, going to school, going to work, whatever it may be, and doing that against tremendous odds. And because part of their survival is blending in, people don't see them. And we've got to talk about that more.
Right. Listen, going to school and going to work is one thing, but to me, the real safety, the real thing is in the evening. Where do you sleep?
Yes.
And where do you wake up? I mean, unfathomable. I mean, it really is to me. And how do you address that? So I'm assuming that Pride Action Network has the Pride Action Tank has resources from the state of Illinois and maybe from the city of Chicago to help address that. Do you guys help guide them, or is it just education?
We don't have resources. So Pride Action Tank is not direct service. We're a project incubator and think tank that's focused on LGBTQ issues. And what we do is through collaboration with many organizations, as well as people with lived experience, address issues like homelessness and aging in the LGBTQ community.
Right, that's going to be something we're going to segue into the next part, because that is something I'm experiencing now. I'm going to be 60 July 1st, and I'm like, wow, I should be more concerned about that.
Exactly. I turned 58 this year. I'm like, these are my people right here. But yeah. So what we do is we try to create a big table for people who touch the issues that we work on, and some of whom live them, some of whom do this as their, as we say, W-2 passion work.
Sure. We all have some of that, yes. I say a lot of us have some of that.
Mm-hmm. And we are very solutions driven. So we worked from the ground up to say, hey, what are you experiencing now? If the world were a better place, what would that feel like? And then how do we get there? So we do things like we are working on a project with La Casa Norte, which is a youth housing organization in Chicago. And we're trying to create a tiny homes community for youth who are experiencing homelessness. That's something that came out of our youth summit. We worked on the Chicago Youth Storage Initiative, which is something that came out of the summit and became this big program to provide the simple thing like storage in youth-serving organizations. Exactly. And that's one of the things that came out in our summit. And this is why it's important to work with people with lived experience, because one of our young people towards the end of the summit shared a spoken word piece with us where they talked about the stigma related to carrying everything they own on their back and the anxiety they had when they had to go to school or work and had to stash that backpack somewhere,
right.
And not knowing if it was going to be there when they got back. And because we created a space that also had funders in the room, funders heard the storage thing, something tangible, but also that has impact. And they wound up funding first a research study that young people led, and then it grew into a citywide project and a partnership with Google to have secure, high definition scanned storage for ID and all the things that can easily be lost and has to be replaced over and over again, but that people need or want, because some of the things are like family photos or,
right.
Those kinds of things.
Well, who thinks about that as part of the homeless problem is the storage of your personal things, your toiletries.
Yes. Your medication.
Clean clothes.
Clean clothes, yeah.
And that's the other thing. Where do they shower? Where do they, the things that I take for granted and many people take for granted. So the question I have is there progress being made, or is this one of those issues that is just this deep, dark hole that is there is no light at the end of it?
So this is completely solvable. And I hope one of the things that comes out of this pandemic and the rush to house people because of the understanding of, needing to contain the virus, but also knowing that people can't stay healthy if they have no place to live. My hope is that on the other side of this, housing really housing first really will be seen as an absolute necessity, and the political will be behind it to make it happen. There are organizations that are working diligently every day to house young people and older people experiencing homelessness. But there hasn't been the political will to say, you know what, no young person should be without a safe place, safe and affirming place to lay their head at night. So that's one piece of it. And then it's also about moving upstream to prevent homelessness in the first place. And so young people are homeless for many reasons. Some of it has to do with poverty. Some of it is young people decide themselves that they don't want to be a burden to their family, a family that may be struggling, and they may decide to leave. So we need to make sure that individuals in this country have safe housing, period. And if that becomes the political will, this is not a hard thing to do.
No, and I'll tell you, truthfully, Kim, I mean, I don't want to sound trite on this, but all you have to do is look at the military budget, and I'm a military guy, or look at all these budgets where we are wasting millions and billions and you know what I'm saying? And just a little fraction of that budget could solve this issue. But that's a broader conversation about politics, which really is crazy right now. I wish it was December and Christmas and all of that.
It's even hard to remember that there's a presidential election coming up.
It is. You know what's going to happen? It's going to be November. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
But and truthfully, there's no campaigning or anything. And I'm not looking forward to it, because all it is going to be street fighting and name calling and everything for months on end. And I think that the era of civil political discourse and intellectual debate towards wisdom and understanding is unfortunately a thing of the past. And I don't know if that can be recovered. But be that as it may, this is the thing that I'm taking away from this, is that these line item costs in a budget of first of all, I don't know where we got $3 trillion, but that's a whole other separate. But even if we took a sliver of that $3 trillion and said, hey, we're going to go to these major urban areas and we're going to solve the youth homeless issue first, they wouldn't even miss it, quite frankly. They wouldn't even miss it. So when you say something like it takes political will, what that tells me is that people they're the ones that make the decision. The money doesn't just go on its own. It doesn't say, hey, I'm going to go here or there. Somebody has to decide where it goes. So the point of change has to be with those people, either through the elected officials or through pressure on government agencies so that they reprioritize what their budget focuses are. I personally think that youth homelessness is an abomination to our civilized society. And the second part of that is elder homelessness. Nobody in their life, Kim, in my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, nobody in their life says, I'm going to work all my whole life, and at 70 years old, I'm going to stand out on a street corner in Chicago in the winter and beg for pennies.
Exactly.
Drug problems, family problems aside, mental health issues especially, seem to be the thing. I'm sorry, that is not, in my old age, what I picture a nice, comfy, overstuffed chair, my feet up there, relaxing and whatever. That's what my retirement is relaxing, not being on a street corner. How does one end up there, and how do you pull back from that, especially if it's a mental health issue where they don't want to seek, they don't want to go to a shelter, they don't want to take advantage of services?
Yeah, that's very, very challenging, that aspect of it. And that's, that's part of the population. There are a lot of people who are working and homeless too. Yes. Go to work every day and are homeless. So that it's a requires a multi-pronged response. And one thing that we don't talk about enough in LGBTQ communities is just what older adults have had to deal with, especially when you get to folks who are in this 70, 80-year-old group who have experienced this lifetime of stigma and disgust because people viewed them as an abomination, as having mental health issues. When I was at Affinity, one of the older adults I was having a conversation with talked to me about having electroshock therapy that her parents requested for her out of love.
It's always out of love.
To cure her.
Jesus.
Exactly. They didn't even mention Jesus. They just mentioned love. and you know, they wanted to cure her from the gay. And so that
if
age
only.
group, if only, right? I don't want to be cured.
Yeah.
But
I will
that
tell you,
age group
I'm
in
going to
particular.
segue on that for 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great thing to say because, you know, there was a period when I didn't want to be gay at all because I was like, I don't want this. I want to be married. I want to have kids. I don't want to be part of that because in my own household, there was a stigma against gay people, you know, not a positive one either. You know, I have 4 brothers and 1 sister and it was not positive. And I didn't want to be part of that. And that's why when someone says, "Oh, you know, I love you," I hate the sin, and or I don't love
love the sin or hate the sin,
or whatever they say. I'm like, I literally want to just grab them by the throat and say, "Listen, this is not a choice because if it was, I'm a very strong individual. I would not have chosen this."
That's right.
It took me years to finally come to terms with this is who I am. I accept who I am, and I like who I am. But it did not come easy, Kim. And I can't imagine what that's like for, you know, for anyone. You know, it's just very, very difficult. And elderly people, especially, you know, they go through their whole lives, and at the end of their life, they are discarded. Many of them don't have families. I was reading a whole bunch of things. They don't have families. They don't have partners. You know, I'm lucky. I have a husband together 18 years. We have a daughter. We have 2 grandchildren, mixed race grandchildren. And, you know, we're one of the lucky ones. We're one of the very fortunate, each one of us. But there are many that I read, some of the links that that I was sent are these elderly LGBTQ plus people have no family, no support system, no anything. And I read something that I thought was so fascinating. He said, when I get older, because he had no family, he just wants to go to Mexico or Canada and die.
Yes. Yeah. So, you know, I mentioned the Youth Homeless Summit. We've also had a summit on the issues that LGBTQ older adults face. And so part of what we know is that when LGBTQ folks are going into senior care facilities, long-term care facilities, nursing homes, that sort of thing, they don't feel safe being out. 70% of them feel like they have to go back into the closet after being like living out lives despite the odds for most of their lives. And these are not just the long-term care facilities that we hear the horror stories about. These are also the swankier, very expensive ones that don't even want to take same-sex couples who have the money to pay for all of this. There are a couple of lawsuits now against independent living facilities that have turned down same-sex couples. And these are folks who, like I said, have the resources. Imagine what's happening in those facilities that are not well resourced, where employees aren't paid well, and where there's been no training on LGBT cultural competency. There is a denial that there are LGBTQ people living in the facilities, and the peers of our older siblings, if you will, also grew up in a time where being LGBTQ was, you could be beat up, thrown in jail, all the things.
Oh, yeah.
These folks are also turning on LGBTQ older adults in facilities, and no one is doing anything in many of the facilities. So that's another big piece of work that has to be done. Last year, we worked with Equality Illinois, one of the statewide organizations across the country that focuses on legislation related to making things better for LGBTQ people. We partnered with them on a piece of legislation to add LGBT and HIV status to the Aging Act in Illinois to further protect and recognize that group of folks as folks who could experience hardship and should be protected. And the hope is our follow-up work will be to really encourage those facilities to start doing some cultural competency training, because it would be great if we could build a bunch of LGBTQ affirming housing facilities for older adults. And I'm actually involved in a project to do that, but we cannot build our way out of this situation. We have to make sure that mainstream facilities are ready for our people, and they are not right now.
So that brings up a really interesting question, and that is, in my own life, I am not preparing to be dependent on government agencies to look after my well-being. And so I am, even now, financially planning to make sure that I do not ever have to be at the beck and, what's the word? Not beck and call. What's the word I'm thinking of? At the mercy of someone that doesn't have, or any institution, if you will, that doesn't have my best interests at heart, either social, mental, or physical, or any of that, because of this. That's my biggest fear. See, right now I'm 60, but I feel like I'm 20 and I'm built pretty good and I'm in excellent health and whatever. So I don't have a lot of fear. But you know what happened to me in New York years ago? It was very weird, and I've never done anything like this before or after. I was walking. Don't ask me why, but I was crazy. But back then when you're young and stupid. Younger and stupider. Is that a word? I don't know. But I was walking back.
I think it is.
I was walking back from the village to the Upper West Side where I lived, right? I'm walking along, I'm minding my own business, and I'm with a couple of friends, and we were just talking. And on the opposite side of the street, we're walking past these warehouse kind of buildings, and I'm remembering it as I'm relaying it. So I apologize if I'm looking down, because I'm actually reliving that thing. There was a guy. He was clearly gay. He was very stereotypically gay. He was white, and I mean like white, like that, right? And what do I hear in the background? Is that
You hear my
bird?
wife in the background.
Okay. I was like, somebody's laughing. I was like, okay. Luckily, my husband's taking a nap. This COVID thing has been really stressful on him. But
we're working from home, so it's
all good. But I was walking down the street, and there were 4 or 5, I want to say, younger people surrounding this guy, and they were pushing him to each other. So he was sort of in the middle. He was walking. He was trying to get away from them, and he was pushing them. And it's clear that they were going to beat him up or do something. And without thinking, and very stupidly, I ran across the street and I just plowed into them, just knocked them all over. And I got up and I yelled, "If you pick on someone your own size, like me," right? And they all ran, right? They ran. Now, it's not that I'm a tough guy or anything. I think I took them up by surprise. I wasn't out then. I wasn't out. And I think all that pent up, I don't even know what to call it, but it just came out. And I would never in a million years relate to this person that I was defending, nor would I ever put myself in a position to be around someone like that, because I was still in the military, in the reserves at the time, but still. And it just pent out, it just blew out of me when he thanked me profusely and went back. And my friends were like, "Why did you do that?" Whatever. And I had to quickly think on my feet to come up with an explanation that it wasn't because I'm gay. It's just I didn't like bullies, and I was whatever. But long after that ended, Kim, I started to think that but for the grace of God, there go I. I could have been that person. And right now, I can defend myself. And even now, I can defend myself. But there is going to come a time, the great equalizer called, age.
Yeah.
There's going to come a time where I'm not going to be able to defend myself. And I am going to have to rely on others to look out for my well-being and protection. And I think that's why when Nick brought up chatting with you and some of the work that you're doing, it really struck home for me because one is I'm a family man. I have a daughter. She's 29. My grandkids are 9 and 10, right? They're mixed race. I worry to death about what their life is going to be like in the future, right? Especially what's been going on in Chicago and everywhere across the country. What are these beautiful kids going to have to face? How do you prepare them for that? And I feel completely obligated to do my part in the position that I'm in now to try and make some sort of change if I can. And I am also doing that for me because what happens when I'm 80 years old?
Yeah.
And I can't defend myself. So, and right now what I see is exactly what you say is there is no mechanism to protect us. We're at the mercy of, if we can't get into one of these LGBT owned assisted facilities, or if we can't provide for our own care, guess what? We're hopefully 20, 30 years we're not going to be able to be connected because of, institutional homophobia or whatever you want to call it. So people like you are my heroes. First of all, I have to say this before I even get any further. You give off such a good energy. I feel like all this light is just flowing through my screen. And I was like, I don't deserve to have her on my show.
Thank you. I got that from my mother, who's no longer with us, but she was always a person who just exuded warmth and love towards anybody she came across.
Well, let me just tell you, especially now, it is like, it's nice. It's nice to feel it and to see it. So I just wanted to make a mention of your mother did good by you.
Thank you.
She'd be proud.
I'm sure she hears that.
Yes, you hear that. And so I want to go into a little bit, if I can segue off of this. That's something that was really interesting that I read, and it said, talking about safety, right? And this thing caught me by surprise because I'm a very big supporter of the rule of law and of police as a general rule. And the thing that I read here, I thought was fascinating, it said calling 911 on a client should be viewed as a potential act of violence and should not be taken lightly. Now that is a complete antithesis to the way I was reared. The way I was reared was policemen are your friends. If you need help, go to a policeman, you call them, and they will assist you.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that because that is that's such an interesting statement.
Yeah, and it's a hot topic right now. So I'll say, I think most people have a very complicated relationship with the police, and Black people and other people of color in particular, and back in the day, queer people as well, more broadly. So I'll share a few examples from my own life. I remember growing up in Kansas City, Missouri, which, the more I'm in Chicago, the more I view that place as the South.
I've been there several times, and I
didn't feel like the South then. It's coming along, though. And I remember I was probably, 5, 6 years old. My family, one of my older cousins, grown cousins, so maybe my second cousin, I think he was in his 20s at the time. He came into the house all bloodied. And of course, the family was like, what happened? All the things, everybody is worked up. And he said that the police beat him up because they thought he was in the Black Panther Party, which was big in the 70s. He was just walking from the bus stop to home, and that happened to him. Flash forward many years later, I'm grown. I had just visited my family in Kansas City, just returned home, got a call from one of my relatives that my brother and one of my cousins had been shot, and my cousin had actually been killed. To this day, I don't know what happened. It was not police related. It was someone they knew who shot them. And, we're going through the whole court system over the years, and all I want is for this guy to go to jail and to fry.
They caught him then?
They caught him.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't hard. And then, so those are stories from my life. One where I witnessed the aftermath of the police beating up an innocent person, and one where I wanted the police to catch the person and send them to jail. I've had conversations with young people who were in favor of more the blue box cameras being installed in alleys, and young people who don't want the police anywhere near them. So it's complex. And I will say, I've also been a person who has had to deal with folks who have been victims of hate crimes. And the only thing that gave that victim relief was knowing that the perpetrator couldn't afford to make bail to get out of jail. But the bail system is very disproportionately adverse to Black and brown people. Mm-hmm. And people linger in jail, they haven't even gone to trial. They just can't afford to get out. So I'm naming a lot of things that are complicated when it comes to our criminal justice system, including the police. I've also seen police show up and just immediately wreak havoc on folks, not even knowing what's going on. So calling the police for some organizations, especially those that work with young people, has many, many ramifications.
Sure.
For the young person,
I can see that.
Yeah, for the young person who wants some relief, who might be getting beat up or whatever the case may be, they want it taken care of.
Well, they're already in crisis, and if you have a disproportionate police response, it's an exacerbation of an already difficult situation.
Exactly. And then we know that in some places, police are going to de-escalate the situation and all parties can walk away. And in other situations, police are not even going to try to de-escalate. They're just going to start arresting people.
Right.
And race has a lot to do with that.
You know, it's funny. You mentioned that my own daughter, we were talking on Facebook, and she was talking, this is what happens when you have kids and you raise them to be independent free thinkers, and then they become independent free thinkers and use it on you.
Yes. I have children too.
I was like, oh, what did we do? But I guess we did something right. But she's watching what's happening in the country, and she has 2 mixed race children, and she's like fearful for them. Right now they're 9 and 10, but what happens when they're 19 and 20?
Exactly.
And I can't even imagine. I don't even want to imagine. Truthfully, Kim, I can't even get my head around it because I would lose my mind if somebody, hurt them. But the issue that the way I grew up was policemen were your friends, and as long as you didn't get any trouble, you never had to deal with them. But now it's such that you do deal with them whether you're in trouble or not.
Yeah.
Because when I have to tell you, I drove the other day. I was in Lakeview, and I was driving north, and I forget where we're going. We're going somewhere. But anyway, we're going somewhere, and a police car got behind me. And at first I'm like, oh man, he keeps turning where I'm turning. So you know that at any minute those lights are going to go on and I'm going to get a ticket, or they're going to stop me and just check, let me see your license and registration, et cetera. I wasn't doing anything wrong. But then I thought to myself, now, DJ, you're who you are. Now let's just change one thing.
Yep.
Let's just change your skin color.
Yep.
And what does that feel like?
Yeah.
And would I be treated the same way? And so I'm trying to educate myself about that, because I've never been exposed to that, Kim. And it's not my fault. I just have never been exposed to that. And I've always been of the mindset that if you work really hard, you can achieve anything. But that's not really the case, is it? You can have all the right things and do all the right things and still not achieve that. And you can do all the wrong things and achieve a lot, depending on who you are. Please, I know a lot of people that should not be where they are. But I want to bring up a point that came up. I'm preparing for a speech. I'm going to give a speech in October at a conference in Las Vegas. And one of the things that I'm sort of researching is, the hot topic right now is everything that's happening in the country. And one of the things that I asked myself is like, okay, institutional racism, is a mechanism to prevent people from achieving their full potential. I get it. If that's the case, how do people like Barack Obama circumvent that or penetrate that to reach a certain level of success? And I use him as an example. I could use a whole bunch of other people as an example. How come they can find a pathway to success, but so many can't? And that is, to me, that is the fundamental question that I'm trying to educate myself about is what is the big difference? And because to me, if we can figure that out, that's where we should focus our resources, is making sure that there are more of those pathways.
I think it's that, but it's more though, because even with, Barack Obama's success, if he didn't have security detail around him and he was just a Black man driving his car, he still has a chance of being pulled over by the police. And
can you imagine?
None of that matters. Right. There was a story a few years ago about professor at Harvard or Yale.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Bates. Yeah.
I know the story you're talking about.
Yes. Trying to get into his own house.
And he got arrested.
Yes. And the officer was not kind to him at all. And then we see the stories, the bird watching story where, here's a guy. That is so
horrible.
Yeah. So,
as a native New Yorker, I know that area of Central Park. I was like, first of all, she's killing her dog, so she shouldn't have that dog, because we love animals. And
they took the dog,
but she got it back. Believe it or not.
Oh, did she?
Yes, but they took the dog. But I'm like, first of all, you're choking your dog to death, and then your craziness here. And now I'm gonna geek out on you for 2 seconds, just because I think you're a wonderful person and I feel like I can do it. But I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and to find out that, thank you. Hear that, Nick? Nick doesn't care one way. He doesn't. He literally doesn't. I had a show about the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars, and he was completely apathetic about it.
Damn, Nick.
Of us, I know, seriously. But did you know that he was also a writer that created one of the first LGBTQ characters for a Star Trek comic?
I didn't know that, but I read some of his comic books. Yeah,
so I was really pissed off. I was like, first of all, he's very articulate. He's a bird watcher. He's a nerd and a sci-fi geek. He is about as least of a threat to you as possible. And he was giving your dog a treat, and you went bat crazy on him. Now, she lost her job, and she had some other ramifications, and absolutely, in my opinion, rightfully so, because her underlying preconceived notion of who he was absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely. It should be absolutely condemned universally. I'm trying to get him to be on my show, number one, because I want to talk about that incident. Number two, I want to talk about the Star Trek comic of things. And but I do understand that, and that's hard for me to understand. That's hard for me, Kim, to wrap my hands around, to wrap my thoughts around, because as an intellectual person interested in knowledge and wisdom, I can't understand I can't understand it. Like, I don't know why, but I for some reason can't understand how somebody could not like you because you're African American, and it discount everything else emanating from you and who you are, and something as irrelevant as the melanin content of your skin.
But they don't see me.
That's right. They don't even get past that part.
Right. That's not what they see. They see a history of, stereotypes and thoughts and things that have been left to fester and not be challenged. They don't, and I shouldn't say they. I mean, it could be anybody. We have all been conditioned to see the white body as the standard, and everything else is a deviation from that. And I'll venture to say the white male body as the standard, and everything else is a departure from that. And so it's embedded in the psyche. It's an unconscious bias that's been cultivated generation after generation over hundreds of years. So we have to work really hard to undo that. And even when we know that that is the thing that's sort of moving us when we don't know it, really fight hard to do what is not always natural to do, to see people as people, and to take those labels off, but at the same time, honor those differences, honor those cultures, honor race, and not see people as all the same, or that should even be the goal, that everybody is the same. So it's a lot, and at the expense or possibility of being a little controversial, I don't think the answer is always to fire someone. There's no discussion. There's no, let's talk this out. It's just, you're out of here. And then that person hasn't learned a damn thing other than maybe to be quiet.
That's like, I'm watching on social media. I don't comment very often on social media because it's so volatile. But there's a kids cartoon, and now they want to ban there's a whole bunch of little dogs, and there's one of the Paw Patrol, right?
Oh,
and I know that because I know that I know about this because my granddaughter loves Paw Patrol. But anyway, there's a movement out there to ban the police dog. The police one on the cartoon. And I just think to myself, come on, how far is this going to go? There are, I don't know how many policemen, there's a percentage of bad ones, but how is it okay to paint the whole police force with a broad brush? Why can't we just say, okay, they're bad police, like they're bad people, they're bad anyone. But I also believe where I think that the real focus should be is not the police is one thing. How do I say this? And I don't know even how to articulate it, but watching the video of that police officer on George Floyd's neck, if that doesn't outrage you as a human being, forget your color, Kim, forget your race, forget everything. Yeah. Going back to what my mother said, as a human being, if that doesn't outrage you, if that doesn't absolutely outrage you, something's wrong with you. And that's what it did. It outraged me about that treatment. I just can't even articulate it any further than that. It's just outrageous. However, where I think the bigger issue is number one, police in general now have become small military forces, right?
Yes.
And I mean, listen, as someone who's in the military, I flew C-130s. I was in plenty of combat. I see some of these SWAT teams and police forces. They are a military unit. They're not, the policemen that I remember that walk the beat or you talk to or anything. These are military things, and these guys think they have no accountability. In a lot of times, in a lot of cases, that scares me. Yeah, that scares me a lot. And so but the second part of what I want to say is where I see the biggest issue is in the criminal justice system. Something you said earlier was fascinating. I knew that factoid, but I hadn't heard it in a while, and that is how the bail system is disproportionate. But more importantly, it's the jail sentences are disproportionate for
sure.
Similar crimes. So why is that? And that's where we need to make the change, because ultimately when I go before, and luckily I haven't done that very often, but for traffic and so forth, but you go before a judge and he's like, okay, this guy is a dispassionate judge and he is not going to have any of the emotion of disagreeing with the officer, right? The arresting officer or the citating officer. He's going to go out there and say, okay, listen, this officer did this and you did that, and I'm going to dispassionately hand down my judgment according to the law without favor to anything else. That's where I think the breakdown is. I think even if you have a run-in with the police, you don't even have the protection of the judicial system to sort of say, okay, I'm going to stop this from going any further. It just continues and goes on and on and on. How do we stop that? How do we interject and slow that down?
Well, the breakdown is many places, right? Why are police stopping people in the first place is one thing. And a lot of times, again, no crime has been committed. But you mentioned, say a percentage of cops are bad. And I believe that's true too. And I'm having this is a moment of learning and thinking and imagining for me around police. I work with a lot of activists who want to abolish the whole prison system, the policing systems, and all of those things. And my knee-jerk reaction at first was like, oh no, we have to have something, or not everybody is bad. And I'm coming to a place where I think we really have to imagine a different system. And it's not enough for me to say that there's just a few bad cops. The institution is bad. The institution was created to find slaves and bring them back to their masters. So with that sort of underlying history, and all that is evolved in this country around race, I am no longer comfortable saying that we have to have the police. We have to have something to make sure that people are held accountable, but also.
But is that a realistic, truthfully, is that a realistic goal that can be obtained? I know that there's a lot of call for that right now. And I don't know if that is.
It can be. I mean, you're a sci-fi person. How many things have you seen in sci-fi that were like, oh my God, that can't happen?
I know. I wish Gene, you can just tune out for a second, but I wish Gene Roddenberry's version of the future, could really be today, where none of this really mattered. There was no money. There was no aspiration towards that. It was more.
Well, he had some gender issues, though.
He did have some gender issues. But thank God we had Sulu, who pushed back a little bit. But, and then also, of course, we had, from my perspective as a young kid watching Star Trek, I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
There's a black lady. There's an Asian. You know what I mean? I didn't grow up I grew up in an all white house.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And to see that on television was really my first exposure to multicultural, all working together in one thing.
In a way, it was for me too. I grew up in a Black household, and at a time where, there was white flight out of cities. So my school, when we moved into our house in Kansas City, when I went there in kindergarten, my class was predominantly white. I was one of maybe 5 Black kids. By the time I got to 3rd grade, there were maybe 4 white families in the whole school. So I had, growing up, a very, very Black experience. It wasn't until I got to college that I was more, had to be in the same spaces with majority white. So Star Trek was like mecca and utopia.
It was,
for me.
And me too. As you know, because my parents were not, they're not like parents are today, and they talk about all these things. My parents never talked about race relations or anything like that. We didn't grow up that way. So seeing it in action was really eye opening. But you bring up a point. I want to go back to the police, and I always think that even in Star Trek, they had security, right? They had a security, the red shirts. And that if you wore a red shirt, you're only in the show one time.
Yeah.
Because they killed you off. Every red, I always thought, I never wanted to buy a Star Trek red shirt because I always thought that was
you didn't want to be that person.
I didn't want to be that person. But I was reading somewhere today, and this is all new, but I was reading somewhere today that one of the cities, I think Minneapolis, their city council voted to defund the police, and then they're going to do community enforcement of some sort. And I wonder what does that look like? Like, how do people that want to commit crimes or gangs or drugs or whatever, how does a community focused police force, or for whatever you want to call them, how do they protect us from that?
Well, I think that's what has to be worked out, right? The police force we see today, and you brought this up too, evolved over time.
Yeah.
It wasn't always this. So I think it is, it's a collective effort to figure out what that looks like. And
right. And I didn't mean to bring up such a heady issue, because this
it's fine.
And it's not to solve in an hour-long show, but
no.
But I was just curious what your overall opinion was about it, because for mine is like, I agree with you 100% that this has to change, and I am fully in support of this bringing to the forefront the fact that this has to change because of these things. I just don't know what the end looks like.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I don't know what the end looks like either. For me, unlike in the past, though, I am more and more open to going on the journey of figuring out what that is.
Agreed. We can agree on that. I don't know what that is. I
don't know what it is.
I hope some smart people can figure that out. And I want to be part of that conversation, because I think it's an important part of the conversation. But at the same time I don't know enough about it to really have an intelligent, broader conversation. That's something for another show, but that is absolutely, it would be interesting to see where we are a year from now. One of the things my daughter was saying is that if all of this, what she hopes is that all of this upheaval and all of this coming together and all of this collectively shouting for change actually finally does something.
Yeah.
And where we are next year. Now, I want to talk about, I know we're in the final parts of the show, but I want to talk about a couple of things that I read. And one of the things it said, decriminalization of sex work, right? There are two parts to that. Decriminalization of sex work, and then the increasing the amount of health services available to youth without parental consent. So if you can, explain a little bit more about that. What does that mean?
Yeah, so creating the possibility for young people to have health services, whether it's reproductive health or other services without parental consent, is particularly important for young people who are not connected to their families. We talked about young people earlier being kicked out of their homes or leaving home, but there are also young people living at home who are not in the safest of environments. There are young people who are experiencing mental, physical, sexual abuse within the home or within a place where they are purportedly safe, who need the agency to be able to make decisions about their health, whether it's reproductive services or whatever it may be. So that's one piece. Legalization of sex work. So that's a whole nother show as well. But I think part of the conversation is around people having the right to make a living from, you lost audio, people having the right to make a living with sex work. A lot of times the folks who have been penalized for sex work are the women or others who, in some cases, trans women who are just trying to survive. And that is the most lucrative way for them to do that. And there's something in this country around consensual sex. We just don't, we think it's a bad thing. And that's a notion that has to end. So legalization is part of sort of moving us forward into the real world and into people's ability to make a living with their bodies if that's what they want to do. I think part of the reason it's criminalized is that the United States just has a weird relationship when it comes to sex. We don't like to talk about it. We like to regulate it and in all the variations of it. But legalizing sex work does a couple of things. It can help provide benefits and safety for folks who are engaging in sex work, especially the folks for whom this is their living. It provides an opportunity to increase their wages, as well as their access to health care, if it's considered to be a legal job. Also, this is criminalizing sex work between two or more consenting adults is another way that society polices bodies. And it is, from a philosophical perspective, it's from another time, right? A very puritanical time that some people think we're still in, but we obviously are not. So the outcomes for cisgender and transgender women in particular can be so much better. We see over and over again trans women, especially trans women of color and Black trans women in particular, having increasing harm against them as they are engaged in sex work, which is often the only job, if you will, that they can have that will provide adequate income for them to live their lives.
So you're saying that legalizing sex work for individuals of legal age, right? Mm-hmm. Because the reason why I asked that and the reason why I was curious about it is when I purchased a newspaper in another Midwestern town, I won't mention any names or places, the publisher was an older person, and he preyed on these homeless youth people under the guise of I'm helping them, right? Now I'm going to be direct here. This is the New Yorker in me, but he would go out and he'd go to the bus stop and he'd find someone that didn't have a place to stay and say, "Oh, you could come stay with us, and here's a cell phone. I'm going to give you food, and all you have to do is this," right? And he's 70, they're 18. Yeah. Right. And I get it. I don't agree with it, but the other person was 18 of legal age to make that decision. But that's a real thing that happens.
Absolutely.
And oftentimes something you said really struck home. It might be the only thing at 18, if they've been kicked out of their house unprepared, that they have the skills for to help them eat or to help them, find a place to live or whatever. But I wonder, I guess my curiosity is how do you make that distinction, right? Like, how do these people that, let's say, like this publisher who wanted that relationship with that younger person, what prevents them from crossing that line and going, below the legal age?
There's nothing preventing them from crossing the line other than the possibility of getting caught. the reality is there are younger people engaged in sex work, especially after they are no longer living at home, because that is the only way they can make money or eat. And the issue is that young people should be protected. They should have safe homes. They should have the ability to be kids. That's a matter that is different. And there's clearly, anytime someone is having or engaging in the survival economy, whether it's sex work or selling drugs or selling goods that come from somewhere we don't know, there's a power dynamic going on there. And oftentimes we punish the person who is in the vulnerable position of having to make a living and don't punish the person who is preying upon these folks. And it's kind of a dual-edged sword. On the one hand, you want people to be able to survive. You don't want them to have to make those kinds of choices, though. And
I totally agree. And first of all, I love that term survival economy, because that's really what it is.
That's what it is.
It's a sub economy, just like the off the books economy, people doing but the survival economy is, hey, I'm doing what I have to do, not to make a living or prepare for the future, but just to survive.
That's right.
Just to survive. Right. And that's a horrible choice to have to make, especially when you're young. I'm always fascinated by the what you said, the power dynamic between those people that are in power, that have all of those things that society says we should have as a successful person, and then we use that as a weapon to against someone that has nothing and nothing to lose and is participating in that survival economy. And then what happens when they're done with them? Right? They just get cast aside. What is the emotional consequence? What is the impact on their psyche going if they mature into adults? Because what did I read? That your brain doesn't fully mature until you're 25, I think, right? So from age 25, you are completely malleable and impressionable. Yeah. So you have someone taking advantage of you, and next thing you know, you become desensitized, or you become, disassociated with society, or you have no empathy, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can go on and on. How do you recover from that? And how do you identify those key moments when someone is being subjected to that, and how do you interfere with that progression before it gets to that point?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's sort of outside of my realm of experience. But in the work that we have done, even in convenings of young people, I've had conversations or heard conversations.
Right, I would suspect that homeless youth would be the highest demographic, if you will, of people vulnerable to that. I would imagine that it's once you get past the, hey, my parents kicked me out and now I have to find a place to stay, but now I have all these people preying on me, willing to give me money if I do this. What is a long-term impact on self-esteem and everything? And how do you become a productive member of society after that? You know what I mean? I don't know. I was lucky. I never had to be confronted with that, but I would imagine in homeless youth, especially LGBTQ homeless youth, because then it's already built in that, hey, you're already predisposed to this. I don't know.
A lot of trauma.
That's a lot of trauma. I mean, I feel traumatized just asking the question, quite frankly.
I know. I will say, though, one thing that I've observed with young people who are experiencing homelessness is how they really look out for each other. I mean, it's amazing how they really look out for each other, from connecting each other to resources at organizations, to sharing meals and whatever, the clothes off their back. all the things. And
it's amazing the resiliency of the human spirit.
Yeah, and you hate that has to be tested, right? I mean, resiliency is something is a word that I use a lot too. But to have resiliency show up means that there's been some trauma. There's been something that happened that has to make you resilient.
Yes.
And I don't want young people to have to be resilient.
No, I got to tell you something, Kim. I'm going to share something with you. It's heartbreaking. When I first got together with my husband, right, our daughter is his biological daughter, and his wife, and he was married to a woman, his wife had and continues to have major drug issues, right? And I remember, I came from a very stable home, 2 loving parents, all of that. And here I met this 10-year-old girl, right? And she's worried about her mother being evicted. She's worrying about, her mother not being able to pay the rent, and she's not going to have enough food and this and that. And I remember telling Joe, I said, what 10-year-old should be worried about those things?
Exactly.
As parents, it's your obligation to protect them from that for as long as possible. Because let me tell you, if I could turn back time and live with my mother and have her do my laundry and cook my food again, if she was alive, I would never complain. Never, ever, ever, ever complain. Because adulting is hard. It can be hard.
It is.
So, and that's as an adult looking back. But what about a 10-year-old? A 10-year-old child worrying about that? I can't even imagine what it's like to be a young person, with your whole support structure ripped out from underneath you. So that is a show I would love to have you back on to talk specifically about the trauma of LGBTQ youth, African American LGBTQ youth especially. What happens when a 16-year-old, 15-year-old are put out from their family and their whole support structure is ripped out from underneath them? What is that like? First of all, just the trauma of going from a safe environment to the wolves, for lack of a better term, is gives me chills.
Yeah, and I'm going to say, for any child being put out, because, you mentioned that I co-host Outspoken, and I and others hear stories on that stage that I call it sacred ground because people share so much.
How do you not fall apart and cry?
Well, sometimes I do. And the whole audience. The trick is bringing them back from those stories. But yeah, and it's really opened my eyes and helped me really understand the words. Everybody has a story. We say that, but we don't always internalize that because, again, we make knee-jerk assessments about people. And not see them as human beings who have stories. And just any young person having that support system ripped out is heartbreaking. And I think it's probably even more so for a young person who has come from that 2-parent middle-class household, who hasn't had to think about resources, hasn't had to think about how does a bill get paid, hasn't had to really, I mean, there's suffering and then there's suffering, right? but hasn't gone through that kind of hardship, and then all of a sudden they're out.
Right. Like my daughter, her biggest issue when she was growing up, when she starts becoming a teenager, was curfew and, staying up late and all of that. What is it? What happens if all of a sudden I said, okay, listen, you need to move out tomorrow or right now, and you're 16.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you another thing. I'm going to close out with this and I'll give you the final words on it. By the way, I could probably talk to you for,
I know, right?
3 more hours.
Easily.
As a Christian person, I often am absolutely stymied by people saying, I'm putting you out in the name of God or because of what have you. And so I've armed myself with scripture and about all of this, right? And one of the arguments that I gave in a in a heated debate, and I got roundly booed at a conference about this. And I said, listen, first of all, and I'll try and summarize this quickly, but I said, the Old Testament was a preparation for Christ, right? And I'm not going to get all religious, but this is just information. It was a preparation for Christ. The New Testament is his life on earth. So why are you cherry picking things from the Old Testament, like from Leviticus or Corinthians, using that to discriminate now? It doesn't make sense. You in fact are violating the whole truth that you like to hold up as your measurement, which is Christ's teachings, and that is completely wrong. Because I can go to the Old Testament and say, oh, by the way, if you menstruate, when can I start stoning you? Or if your husband dies and you get to be the property of his brother. If you're going to cherry pick. And Christians emphatically always say to me, well, I just love Jesus. Like that's what they say to me. Yeah. And I think to myself, especially those people that put their kids out on the street, that they are so far away from what Christ intends them to do regarding issues like this with their children. And yet, we have no religious leaders standing up emphatically saying that. Mm-hmm. They'll say it quietly or they'll say it here and there, but these major leaders are not standing up to saying that. And I look at this and I say, I look at youth homelessness especially, and I say, the first thing is you love your kid no matter what, right? Parents love murderers. They love kids. It doesn't matter. You love your kid no matter what. You don't put them out in the street just because of something as so inconsequential in the makeup of their whole psyche as their sexuality. It's just one facet of a multifaceted human psyche. And you protect your kid, you protect your child. Why would you put them into the absolute worst scenario possible? I don't understand it, Kim. And to the day I draw my last breath, I will never understand it. And nobody can ever have a valid argument in my mind that justifies doing that. I want to see the day when there's no need for someone like you.
Same. Yes.
Right. But until then, this is what we have to do. Education, well, first of all, you got to deal with the problem. You got to deal with the fact that these kids are on the street or they got kicked out or whatever. And then you deal with, trying to educate people and trying to change hearts and minds. And after talking to you, I feel empowered and impassioned to try and help in whatever way that I can, because this is something that has always been important to me. And I've never really, I hate to say, I've never really done anything except talk about it. So I hope we'll stay connected.
Oh, we'll definitely stay connected.
And I hope that you'll reach out to me. And I sent you a link to my advisory board.
Okay.
You can see who's on it. These are the big players in LGBT media. We can help. I commit to helping.
Okay. That is wonderful to hear, DJ. And I'm going to take you up on that.
I hope you will.
I will. And I hear what you're saying about how unconscionable this is, that young people get kicked out. And I will say, my experience is that people who kick their kids out still love them. The challenge that we face is one, this sort of ongoing drumbeat of who is worthy and who is not. But also, when people have to let go of something that they've believed for so long, you also have to give them something to hold on to. And I think a lot of times, and I'm not excusing any parent for kicking their kid out. And I will say, as someone who has parented, there have been moments where I have wanted to close the door.
You're preaching to the choir. I told Joe, I said, we can change the lock. It only takes an hour.
But I bring that up because, one, frustration of parenting, but also it's not about going toe to toe with people. It's also about helping them let go of something that is a central belief to who they are and hold on to their child at the same time. And a lot of times in LGBTQ spaces, because of our own personal experiences, We don't want to help the parents. The parents are evil, and that's all.
Right.
But we have got to figure out how to stop the flow of youth onto the streets. And that means we have to deal in some ways with parents.
I want to tell you something that my mother said that that addresses that. I'll never forget it, because we were sitting at the table and she said, I don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand what this is. But what I do understand is I love you. You're my son. And that is something that I can get my arms around. And I think that has to be the first thing, is like, okay, you love your son. You don't or a daughter or whomever. You don't have to understand the dynamics of everything they're going through.
Right.
But you can understand that you love them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Everything else is teachable, Kim. Everything else,
absolutely.
Everything else is discussion. But if you start with that,
you
don't throw someone you love. That would be my first comment.
Yeah.
Do you love them? Yes. Why would you throw somebody you love on the street?
And those are the kinds of conversations I have had with parents one-on-one. But they sometimes, some, not all, also need to go through the fears that they have, because that's what's happening. And they don't want to, and it's a weird thing, right? You're not facing your fears. You're casting the fear aside and creating a situation for the young person in your life to come up against some super scary stuff that you cannot even begin to imagine. But by talking to people, and again, having them go through that cycle of I'm afraid for my child, I'm afraid, I don't want them to be this way because da-da-da-da-da, a lot of times can create a pathway to having a household where that young person can be there, be themselves, is not great, but they can be at home and not on the street and not be ostracized in the home. But if we don't work in the home too,
right,
we're going to continue to see this.
Kim, when I came out and everything was whatever, I still was respectful of my mother's home. If I was seeing someone, I brought them home. We didn't, do overly PDA or anything like that. We were respectful because we didn't want that. It took me many years to feel comfortable even holding a hand of my now husband in front of my family. Now they don't care. They love him. He would say they love him more than they love me.
I get that too.
And that could be true. There's too much history. And so I think that is that sort of security is what helps everything go forward. If you can get to that point where even if they don't understand that, even if the parents don't understand, that they can at least still say, okay, I don't understand, but I'm willing to learn. But first I want you to know I love you. That's the first thing.
That's the first thing.
That's the very first thing. Because to me, when that happened, when my mother said that to me, my initial thought was, okay, now I don't care what anybody else thinks, because now I have the support and of my family and acceptance of my family. I could deal with whomever,
Yeah.
And so often these kids that are put on the street, they don't have that because they don't even have the chance to have that conversation, let alone reach that level. Now I want to talk about one last thing. Got to look past. I wrote all over my notes with all my stick figures and Star Trek references. I'm sure Nick is sort of like, what is wrong with you? Okay. Talking about police violence, disproportionate. How does it affect LGBTQ youth? And do you think it's similar to African-American people and police violence? And then how wide is the gap, in your opinion, between services available to LGBTQ youth and services available to anybody else?
Wow, that's you.
Is that another show?
You got a lot in there, my friend. So, one thing I'll point out is that there is an intersection between Black youth and LGBTQ youth, right? So, and sometimes when it comes to policing, it is the Blackness that is seen and not the queerness. And oftentimes, queer and trans people of color live in people of color communities. So that is particularly true in a place like Chicago with major segregation. So what is being experienced in communities of color in terms of policing and all the other issues are also being experienced by LGBTQ people of color. So I say that to say it's the same. So they're experiencing the same types of violence or policing, depending on the community that you're in.
Sure.
There's no distinction between LGBTQ and race in that context. I think there are never enough services for LGBTQ youth. And I don't know that there will ever be enough LGBTQ specific organizations. So again, I go back to, while I am absolutely for supporting LGBTQ affirming housing, LGBTQ focused organizations, I run them, I want them to continue to exist. We also have to make sure that mainstream institutions are competent and that the staff and leadership maintain their humility around cultural competency and the need to continuously learn to make sure that they're taking care of LGBTQ folks who are utilizing their services. I think in this moment, there is a very much an opportunity for the queer and trans community, mainstream in particular, to be much more engaged in the movement for Black lives because, in part, of that shared history around police brutality. Our modern LGBTQ movement started with a riot with Stonewall, and that was precipitated by ongoing incidences of police harassment and brutality. And we see the same in Black communities. I think the scale is different, the intensity is different, but there is that historical shared experience that could bring these movements together. And in many ways, especially among people of color, there's already an overlap that would be incredibly powerful in terms of gaining not just the laws that are needed, that are important, but you mentioned hearts and minds earlier. And ultimately, that's where we have to be. The civil rights movement made great progress, but it was the appeal to hearts and minds that has made the cultural shift in the past, where it would be embarrassing for someone to make blatantly racist comments. I say in the past because we're in an era.
We'll call it bizarro world.
Bizarro, where it's not so embarrassing anymore.
Quite frankly, Kim, the only thing missing from 2020 is a moon-sized comet impacting the Earth.
You're right, because locusts are actually waking up after.
But the cicadas, right? After 17 years, I'm like, okay, listen, I feel like right now I need to be in Egypt somewhere.
What the hell? We're only 6 months into the year.
I don't know how I'm going to make it. I swear, this is probably going to be my last show. I'm going to go to a beach somewhere on some tropical island. It'll probably have a volcano with my...
Right. Or be underwater by the time you get there.
But, I will tell you that there's so much that we can talk about. And I think there's so much that we can do together. Mm-hmm. And I'm committed to doing that. And I want to say, I know that we've kind of run over a little bit. I could see by Nick's expression. Nick is so patient with me, I swear. I don't know how he puts up with me. But I could talk to you for 2 hours and probably more over so many different topics. Kim, it has been such a joy to have you on the show. It's been such a pleasure to have an intellectual debate with you about some pretty tough topics and some depressing topics. Mm-hmm. But knowing that people like you are involved in it, knowing that you are doing the good work that you're doing, gives me hope that there is a light at the end of that tunnel. And by the way, you're just a wonderful person. And I'm saying that from my opinion, and but I think you're a wonderful person.
Thank you.
So your mom would be so proud, and anything that I can do, I sent you a link. It has my email in there as well. Please reach out to me. I would love to, when all of this is over, get together and meet you in person and maybe talk about something that we can do together, or how I can help you get that message out on a broader platform using some of the connections that I have.
I appreciate that, DJ. I will definitely respond to that email. And also, I just want to thank you for having me on the show. This has been
of course.
Wonderful.
The fact that you're a Star Trek fan, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you're in the A+ section of guests on the show. And we'll have to talk about that more too. But Kim, you have a wonderful weekend. And I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
That sounds great. You and Nick have a great weekend too.
Thank you, Kim. Bye-bye. Give our best to your wife too. Bye-bye.
I will. Bye-bye.
Bye.